So I wanted to ask you, you tweeted something last night. Is D.C. ignoring Trump's pardons? If it is, then this is definitely a time to repeal D.C. home rule. You had me at the word repeal. D.C.'s government has no right to exist constitutionally. Congress shouldn't have delegated its lawmaking authority over D.C. It's time to take it back. I love you. Okay, tell me what this means.
What this means is that Congress needs to do its job. We've had a problem for a long time with Congress delegating its lawmaking power to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. We've got a corresponding problem in that we're supposed to be the lawmaker for the District of Columbia. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, sometimes known as the Enclave Clause, gives us that power. We've been delegating that to the D.C. government for about a half century. The results have been disastrous. The results have been a government that doesn't serve the interests of the people well. It's a radical leftist regime that runs it. Their schools are failing. Crime rates are soaring. And last night, from what we can tell, after Trump issued a pardon for a number of prisoners involved with January 6th, there were only 2 released last night. And I spoke to someone last night who had gone down personally to the D.C. jail, saw that only 2 of them had been released, and jail officials at the D.C. jail announced that they wouldn't be releasing any more last night. Now, this is not hard, Glenn. They have names, and they have pardons. They can identify those prisoners who have been pardoned. Trump's directive was that they were to be released immediately, as one should when one sees that somebody's been pardoned, and they still weren't out. So we're still trying to get names, numbers, and verify that this is how this is happening. But from what we can tell, they haven't complied with it yet. It's yet another reason to revisit D.C.'s home rule, which I think should be repealed.
That's extraordinary that they would be that bold and say, because everybody was watching them last night. I haven't heard this reported. I mean, CNN is the only thing I can get in this stupid hotel. By the way, if anybody on my staff books me at a hipster hotel one more time, heads will roll. I want actual furniture, not beanbags. Thank you.
The hipster hotel feels exactly the same way, by the way.
Oh my!
They were really
What'd you say?
In the 70s, so you know.
Oh, they were very popular, and who doesn't love them? I'm not 18 years old anymore. Please book me in an adult's room. Anyway, he was watching CNN last night, and they had people stationed out there, and they were just complaining that criminals that had killed police officers on January 6th were just being released. You're saying that there's only 2 that were released last night and only nothing yet this morning that you know of?
That's right. That's right. My former staffer, Sean Peterson, was down at the D.C. jail, and he said that they released 2 of them through a back door, and then a jail official said, we're not releasing any more tonight, even though there were apparently many more to be released. Now, again, Glenn, these are people who have been pardoned, and this is a government that has done things like this for a long time. I've got story after story of horrible things they've done. D.C. allows non-citizen voting in their local elections. You know how difficult that can be to disentangle the people who are casting votes in local elections from those who are voting in true federal elections. That is a problem in and of itself. You've also got the fact that they've just, time after time, they've taken positions that harm the people of D.C., make everything more expensive. These guys have high tax rates. They spend like crazy in education, yet they've got one of the most failing school systems in the entire country. You want to know something interesting? 4 years ago, an elite unit from the Utah National Guard was out here in D.C., protecting D.C., protecting the White House from the violence that was erupting in the summer of 2020 in this city. In the middle of the night, after they'd gone through like a 36-hour shift, none of these guys had slept in 36 hours. They had worked all night. and all day the next day. And they were evicted by the office of the mayor of the D.C. government. These are the kind of people these are. And they've been begging for a repeal of D.C. home rule for a long time. We need it now. They've been begging for it by the terrible things they do.
I want to cut the mayor of D.C. some slack because they might have been high on crack. And I think that, because that is a tradition, isn't it, Stu, for the D.C. mayors to be high on crack?
Yeah, I think it's part of the job description.
Part of the deal. You have to at least be high on crack occasionally, I believe. So Mike, is this going to gain any traction? What are you going to do?
Well, the first thing we've got to do is make sure that these prisoners who have been pardoned are, in fact, released. But I think the word needs to spread. Now, obviously, this is a niche issue. Here it is a local issue, and it's an issue that's very emotional for many of the people who live in and around the area. But I think more and more residents of D.C. are getting wise to the fact that something's not working right. And increasingly on the Hill.
Well, hang on, what does this mean? What would this mean for the judicial system? Because you can't get a fair trial here in Washington, D.C. And, anything goes wrong in Washington, D.C., anybody commits any crimes in the Capitol or in the White House, it's all tried here in Washington, D.C. And it's so corrupt. It's got to stop. What would this mean for that system?
Well, look, at least for the system of deciding who's going to be prosecuted, who would be running the city, would change. And you'd start to see people prosecuted for more things like property crimes. The sort of the Soros-funded prosecutor mentality has infected this city, and it shows. I've lost count of how many members of Congress and how many staff members of members of Congress, and people I interact with most when I'm in Washington, of course, have been assaulted, have been carjacked, have been stabbed, have been robbed, often in broad daylight, often within a block or two of the U.S. Capitol, which is one of the more heavily policed, heavily secured locations anywhere in America. And yet this happens here because there is an environment of lawlessness. The more this happens, the more members of Congress are seeing that this isn't working. This is our capital city. It should be a shining city on a hill. We can't let it slip into this state of disrepair and utter lawlessness.
It would be helpful if people started tweeting and started calling their senator or House member and started some grassroots effort to repeal D.C. home rule. It might gather some attention if people started doing that today. Mike, let me ask you about.
I've been tweeting from my base Mike Lee account over and over again. Repeal D.C. home rule. So if people want to join in this, you can retweet me. You can tweet on your own. Send out posts on X, on any other social media platform. Contact your members of Congress and tell them. The message is very simple. Repeal D.C. home rule.
Mike, the idea that we can no longer go after Fauci or any of the people on January 6th, what does that mean to you?
Well, what it means to me, first of all, is that these guys are going to have a hard time, perhaps an impossible time, invoking the Fifth Amendment, not if, but when they're subpoenaed to testify in congressional hearings. Because if they've been pardoned, then one can rationally, logically conclude that there's no risk of prosecution. And if that's the case, I don't think they can invoke their Fifth Amendment rights to remain silent. And we can finally get to the bottom of exactly what happened. It also means that there was an understanding that some things happened. Some things happened that would otherwise likely be likely to lead to an investigation, if not criminal charges, to be brought against some of these people. But
what do you? Because I watched enough CNN yesterday. I watched CNN enough yesterday to know that they're spinning this as they're just doing this as preemptive against Trump because he's going to go after these poor people.
Yep. So if you believe that, then you're likely somebody who believed Fauci in the first place. And you're quite possibly somebody who, even after Anthony Fauci was caught repeatedly lying, in some cases under oath, to Rand Paul and others who asked them questions. But remember, Rand Paul was raising the question very early on about gain-of-function research. Tony Fauci repeatedly denied that there was gain-of-research funding happening. And, of course, it was all the time. They were covering it up. They tried to use a different name to characterize it, but it was still gain-of-function research. Tony Fauci also spread the false rumor that this was, the result of, a pangolin and a monkey holding hands in a park somewhere in Wuhan, and that produced the virus. And, a lot of people were harmed as a result of this. The COVID deaths and illnesses in and of themselves were bad enough, and the predictable, foreseeable outcome of the U.S. government funding gain-of-research activities in places like Wuhan, a place that was known to have a horrible hygiene record. And that's how things like this happen. People get hurt, and then the country overreacts, and more bad things happen all over the place. Yeah, this has got to be investigated. And yeah, President Biden knew Tony Fauci faced real problems here. That's why Trump needed to act, and I'm glad that Trump is going to see to it that the truth comes out. Biden may well be able to pardon him, and he, in fact, did. But in some ways, that helps us get to the bottom of the truth. We've got to subpoena the heck out of these guys and get the truth out of them.
Because if they tell a lie on the witness stand, if they deny what we now know because of documents to be the truth, they can be prosecuted for that lie, can they not?
Yes, of course. And of course, the whole point here is not, we can't undo the damage these guys did. And the point isn't to torment them for the sake of tormenting them. The point here, Glenn, is that we've got to get to the bottom of the truth, because otherwise this kind of pattern of abusive government continues to happen. And I will flag here the fact that if we understood the nature of the federal government, if we read the Constitution and understood the twin structural protections at the heart of it, the vertical protection that we call federalism, the horizontal protection that we call separation of powers, this crap would end. And so we've got to restore the movement in America, getting people to read and understand the Constitution, particularly the structural Constitution, which has been badly neglected and bastardized over the last 80 years.
Senator, somewhat related question. There was a Friday news dump from the New York Times that outlined the 6 people who basically covered Joe Biden's decline mentally over the past few years. They identify them, they talk about them and their motivations and their tactics. While the way they describe it to the Times, it seems to me really, really bad. Maybe it's not illegal. But my guess is there's a lot of texts and discovery that would lead us to a different conclusion on that. Is there a possibility that we look into that? Is that the type of thing that we could do?
It's certainly something that ought to be the topic of congressional investigations. Now, whether or not people will testify, whether or not they'll be able to invoke the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, whether or not we'll find anything that is a game changer remains to be seen. But we need to try. We need to ask questions, because there's enough just on the face of things. A lot of us saw the mental decline unfolding in real time in slow motion, only we saw just a small sliver of what was actually going on. And then when you add to that the fact that there was this sham debate set up in June, what was it, like the 4th week of June, thought it was very curious that they were agreeing to a general election debate before either candidate had gone through his national convention phase, before either candidate was officially the party nominee. And normally you don't do that until the weeks before the general election. And yet they were doing this. I thought that was really curious in and of itself. But I think the fact that they scheduled it for June, without precedent in modern history, as far as I can remember, indicates that there were some people on the inside, including on the inside of the White House, who knew there was a problem. They needed a way to elbow Joe Biden out, and so they acted. So if they knew that, at least by then, certainly they knew of more things that were happening. And yet nobody in the White House, nobody in the administration was willing to support a 25th Amendment type of a discussion. That they just covered it up, and that's a real problem, especially when you look at all the problems that the Biden administration was creating, and the fact that we now have affirmative reasons to doubt whether Biden was even conscious of all these decisions that supposedly he was making. Somebody was doing that.
Right.
Somebody was messing with America, but we need to know why and how and through whom.
And who. I mean, you know, the revelation that came out from Mike Johnson about, you know, Joe Biden having no idea what he was doing with natural gas is really very disturbing.